is of extreme importance. Language is a spontaneous order. Nobody invented language. No authority ever set the rules for speaking or writing. Hayek tells us that law is like that.
We are living all the time thanks to a system of rules of conduct which we have not invented, which we have not designed, which we largely do not understand.
People have tried out over the time different strategies to solve problems, and they were able to learn which kind of generalized strategies work better than others. And these experiences they have condensed in rules.
These rules, of course, are interpreted by our parents, our authorities. They're interpreted by those with whom we interact, so they do change gradually, but nevertheless, these rules are not of our own making.
It's law that creates freedom by creating a rational framework within which individuals can lead their life. So I think that Hayek's underlying idea in political philosophy is that liberty is the supremacy of law.
Hayek's understanding of the rule of law involved two critical points. The first was that society's rules must be general. They must not become specific centralized commands. This also keeps them from becoming instruments for granting special privileges. True freedom implies equality under the law.
An open society in which I can deal with any person I encounter presupposes that certain basic rules are enforced on everybody within their territory.
Hayek was concerned about how democratic governments fail to safeguard this principle by confusing law with legislation.
Legislation, in a strict sense, ought to be confined to general rules, while what we now call legislation are largely orders, commands issued to particular groups, granting privileges to some and imposing special duties on others.
Hayek's second point about the rule of law was that laws should tell individuals only what they could not do in order to prevent harm to others. Laws should not tell individuals what they must do.
These rules, and this is the characteristic of general rules, they tell people what strategies they are not allowed to employ in their efforts to improve their own situation. But within the remainder of the open space of conceivable actions, they are free to choose whatever they consider most appropriate and more conducive to their interests.
Hayek did grant that government might need to guarantee a minimum set of specific protections in areas such as healthcare, the environment, and disaster relief. But he argued these should be privatized whenever possible. The Constitution of Liberty has taken its place among the great works of classical liberal theory.
Such an immense scholarship I have never before discovered. That is absolutely surpassing. And the ideas there, especially the ideas about the justice problem, about the problem of spontaneous interaction of 10,000s of people, all of them having completely different value convictions, and how we can find people, or we can find ways and means to make people with completely different value convictions to live together in more or less peace and freedom. That was something what still fascinates me. That is actually, for me, the quintessence of economics.
In the early 1960s, Hayek unexpectedly received an invitation to teach in Freiburg, West Germany. Freiburg was the professional home of his old friend and Mont Pelerin Society member Walter Eucken, who had died in 1950. Ludwig Erhard, another Mont Pelerin Society member, was soon to become Chancellor of West Germany. After moving to Freiburg, Hayek pressed on with the development of his ideas on spontaneous order. By 1969, he had almost completed the first volume of Law, Legislation, and Liberty. This work, which he planned to publish in 3 volumes, was to expand on the concerns he had addressed in the Constitution of Liberty.
In the Constitution of Liberty, I was still mainly attempting to restate for our time what I regarded as traditional principles. I wanted to explain what 19th century liberalism had really intended to do. It was only at the time when I practically finished the book that I discovered that 19th century liberalism had no answers to certain questions.
Law, Legislation, and Liberty was eventually to be a work of sweeping scope and substantial importance. But before the first volume was finished, Hayek began to suffer from a severe depression. Years of standing against the academic and political mainstream were apparently taking their toll. Even after he finally finished the first volume in 1973, Hayek's outlook had not improved.
Hayek was feeling so low that he was literally unable to get up from his bed, and when he talked to Arthur Selden, he told him that at that time he felt that his entire life's work had been a waste.
Then in 1974, very unexpectedly, Hayek was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. Ironically, his co-recipient was Gunnar Myrdal, a socialist thinker from Sweden. The Nobel Prize led to a swift reversal in Hayek's reputation. As one writer noted, he quickly went from goofball to guru. It also seemed to spark a burst of energy within Hayek, resulting in renewed health and a dramatically increased intellectual output.
You'd say, no, it wasn't the Nobel Prize, but the Nobel Prize was a tremendous shot in the arm.
In 1976, Hayek completed Volume 2 of Law, Legislation, and Liberty. When news of its completion was delivered to a meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society, cheering erupted. 3 years later, in 1979, the last of the 3 volumes was published.
I thought very highly of Road to Serfdom. I knew how important it had been historically. But Law, Legislation, and Liberty was a revelation.
Hayek used 1 volume each for what he termed 3 fundamental insights on the preservation of a society of free individuals. The first of Hayek's 3 insights was order without commands. This was a further clarification of his concept of spontaneous order. Hayek persisted in combating the misperception that order is equivalent to a single overarching vision or plan. He argued that order occurs spontaneously in society because all of the plans of individuals are coordinated through various mechanisms that transmit information such as market prices, customary practices, values, language, and tradition.
It is very exciting to transpose what one thinks of as a vast network of operations of people exchanging money and goods, suddenly to discover that this really has a totally different aspect altogether. And I think that's a brilliant illumination.
Hayek's second insight addressed the concept of social justice. For Hayek, the term social justice was without any clear meaning and could be used simply to dress up the political bias of the user. As a standard by which to judge the economy, it was at best useless and at worst harmful, since it obscured the real nature of both justice and social order.
Any deliberate attempt to correct the distribution according to supposed principles of social justice are ultimately irreconcilable with a free society.
Hayek believed in what he considered true justice, which sprang from the genuine equality of individuals under the rule of law. Distributive equality was another matter. True justice is impartial and impersonal. Differing conditions among individuals and groups which are not the result of interference do not imply a lack of social justice.
It's not facts which are fair, it's human action which is fair or just. And to apply the concept of justice, which is an attribute of human action, to a state of affairs which has not been deliberately brought about by anybody, is just nonsense.
The third of Hayek's trilogy of insights was that democracy did not necessarily equate to liberty. Confusing democracy with liberalism was, for him, a tragic illusion. Far more important was a constitutional order that would limit the power of government to interfere with the spontaneous order of society. To the degree that democracy holds government officials accountable for their actions, it is an essential part of a functioning political order. By itself, however, democracy is not a sufficient protection for freedom.
That, of course, is no longer the will of the majority, or the opinion of the majority, I prefer to say, which determines what the government does, but the government is forced to satisfy all kinds of special interests in order to build up a majority. It's in the process. There's not a majority which agrees, but the problem of building up a majority by satisfying particular groups.
In the late 1970s, the world was entering a new era, and Hayek's ideas were beginning to have an influence. The simultaneous high inflation and high unemployment, which seemed to be the legacy of Keynesian economics, caused many to begin looking for other answers. In England, Margaret Thatcher was turning the British economy around, largely through reliance on Hayek's theories. Hayek had great admiration for Mrs. Thatcher. Her adoption of his concepts caused some to call Hayek her mad professor.
Once she pulled the Constitution of Liberty out of her bag, placed it on the table, and said, "This is our program." And then extraordinary changes happened in England.
In the 1980s, an economic sea change occurred in the United States. Ronald Reagan had come to office with a new approach based in part on Hayek's ideas. Reagan's administration would bring both inflation and unemployment under control. In 1982, Hayek was awarded the Order of Merit by the Austrian government, and in 1984, he became a Companion of Honor, a personal award from the Queen of England. Hayek's final book, The Fatal Conceit, was published in 1988. In it, Hayek warned his readers against the temptation to assume that social institutions and inherited practices can simply be altered or abolished to suit the momentary objectives of would-be reformers. In 1989, at the age of 90, Friedrich Hayek witnessed the dismantling of the Berlin Wall, the victim of unworkable government economic planning and increasing pressure for freedom. This was the first step on the road away from serfdom and the ultimate affirmation of Hayek's ideas about the nature of order in human society.
If you were a good Hayekian, it should have been inevitable that communism was going to fall, because it should have been inevitable that this terribly inefficient system was going to at some point just grind to a crashing halt.
Nowhere is Hayek as popular and as well respected as in the East European countries, because those people have seen his theories. They have read The Road to Serfdom, which gives an accurate account of the police states and of the conditions under which centralist economic planning can be performed. And they also see the great promise that he holds out for them.
President George Bush presented the U.S. Medal of Freedom to Hayek in 1991. Hayek's son, Dr. Lawrence Hayek, accepted. Friedrich August von Hayek died in 1992. His life had essentially come full circle through two distinct half-centuries in which his reputation had risen, then fallen, and finally risen again, even more strongly. He had seen the ideas of free markets and human liberty go from ridicule to being the centerpiece of social thought. This is Hayek's legacy.
I think that we can divide the 20th century into 4 quarters. The first quarter was dominated by Lenin and the Russian Revolution. The second quarter by Hitler, National Socialism and the World War. The third quarter was dominated by Keynesian thinking. It was really the quarter of Keynes. But the fourth quarter of the 20th century was characterized and dominated in some ways by Hayek.
I think that Hayek will be perceived in retrospect as the greatest political philosopher of the 20th century.
Hayek I regard as a man for all times.